Okay, so we are back to talk about action potentials and how that all or nothing message, that yes no message, travels from the axon hillock, where the decision has been made whether or not to fire, down to the terminal buttons, where it can release neurotransmitter and influence other neurons in the communication chain. So we talked about graded potentials being these tiny fluctuations, and sometimes they're excitatory, sometimes they're inhibitory, and that depends on what ion channel is being opened on the postsynaptic neuron. And we identified the ions that move across the membrane to create these exciting or inhibiting changes in the target cell. And I'll go over that a little bit one more time in just a second. We also said that the axon helix job, it is the physiologically, it's the connection point between the neuron's cell body and dendrites, where graded potentials are influencing the decision of whether or not to fire, and the axon, which carries that message of fire or the message of silence. So it's the physical boundary between the cell body and the axon, and it's the place where this decision of firing or not firing gets made. And it causes an action potential to travel down the axon if the voltage reaches negative 55 millivolts, right there in the axon hillock. We talked about how the sodium chloride and potassium channels out on the cell body and dendrites all open for neurotransmitters. They either open from locked in the case of sodium, which excites the listening cell, or they get sort of kicked wider open from an already cracked open position in the case of potassium and chloride, both of which lower the charge inside the listening cell if those gates are opened. So there's a biological difference between how ion channels open out on the cell body and dendrites, where they're neurotransmitter sensitive, and down here in the axon, where they're voltage sensitive. They're triggered by electrical changes. And that's really important to understanding the action potential. So what we've got to focus on now are the last couple learning objectives from the action potential content, and let's dive in. So action potentials are a huge change in charge that travels down the axon and carries one neuron's message to the neurons that are listening to it. And as I said, they begin here at the axon hillock, which sort of acts like the Washington, D.C. of the cell, kind of counting votes and summing them up. And right now, I want you to imagine that we're able to insert a voltage meter right here into the axon hillock of the cell. Voltage meter is a simple tool that just measures electrical charge. And this one is one that would be used in a car, so it goes up to 18 volts. Of course, inside a neuron, our scale is nothing like that dramatic. And, we're watching for fluctuations of, just a few millivolts. So our voltmeter would need to be really sensitive. And this is actually something neuroscientists can do. We can put a microelectrode into the axon hillock of just one neuron and measure its voltage changes as it makes that all-important decision of whether or not to fire an action potential based on incoming graded potentials coming in from the cell body and dendrites. So I'm going to show you a sort of different looking drawing of a neuron. This is one of my great homemade drawings. So, on NED, we kind of had a compressed scale, but here you see that the cell body is like a big ocean, and these excitatory messages have to travel pretty far to get to the axon hillock. And that's why it takes a bunch of excitation at once to trigger the neuron to fire. So we're going to zoom in right here on the axon hillock. And what you'll see is that I've taken this idea of the voltmeter that shows you the arrow goes to the right when the charge is raising. And I've kind of transcribed it onto the axon hillock of our cell. So right here is the axon hillock. Out here towards the cell body and dendrites, the ion channels open due to neurotransmitter changes. But right here, there's a biological difference. Ion channels down the axon only open for particular voltage, and that voltage is -55. So I'm showing you this as a sort of chain of dominoes that are lined up down the axon of this cell, and you can see that this is our voltage meter. Here's the scale. This cell is hanging out at resting potential, so the voltage right now is -70. And you can see that if the voltage raises high enough to right about -55, it will knock over the first domino in the chain, and that represents triggering an action potential that'll travel all the way down the axon and cause it to release neurotransmitter. So what kind of postsynaptic potential, what kind of graded potential coming in from the cell body and neurons would raise the charge above resting potential? Would that be an excitatory influence coming in from other cells or an inhibitory influence? If electrical changes caused by graded potentials out here in the cell body raise the charge at the axon hillock, getting it a little closer to firing, were those excitatory influences or inhibitory influences? Let's see, I should pull up the chat.
Excitatory?
Yeah, so these are excitatory. So we have sort of the abbreviation term for that, for the graded potentials that are coming in from cells with an excitatory influence, is excitatory postsynaptic potentials. Postsynaptic potentials are just graded potentials, and they're excitatory because they're raising the charge right at the axon hillock and making the cell more likely to fire. On the flip side, if electrical changes detected out in the dendrites lower the charge at the axon hillock, making the cell less likely to fire, those types of graded potentials are known as inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. So they make the cell less likely to fire because they've lowered the charge. So you can see that the charge is now further from that threshold point that would set off an action potential. This is sort of reviewing what I just talked about at the whiteboard. So inhibitory postsynaptic potentials are graded potentials coming in from the cell body and dendrites that decrease the voltage in the neuron and make it less likely to fire, whereas excitatory postsynaptic potentials make the neuron more likely to fire. And each type of graded potential, the excitatory and inhibitory, do that by releasing a neurotransmitter that changes the balance of ions inside the postsynaptic cell, thereby changing its electrical charge. So summarizing what you guys explained before, inhibitory graded potentials, inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, exert their influence by either letting potassium leave the cell or chloride come flowing in. Excitatory connections work their magic by opening those locked sodium gates, letting a flood of positively charged sodium enter the postsynaptic cell, the one that's listening to the message, raising the charge, bringing it closer to fire. And the neuron's whole job is just to make this one important decision in a given moment to fire or not to fire. So now we're finally to the point of discussing the action potential. What is it that happens physiologically, neurochemically, that carries this action potential message down the axon? So whereas graded potentials were tiny fluctuations in voltage, little bitty positive and negative changes that influenced the axon hillock, the action potential is a massive change. It's a huge wave of reversed polarity that sweeps down the axon and travels all the way to the terminal buttons where it triggers the release of neurotransmitter. So when I say reversed polarity, what I mean is that we know that when this neuron is hanging out at rest during resting potential, it's more negative on the inside compared to its surroundings. But during an action potential, the electrical charge inside the neuron raises so much. It swoops up to actually becoming positive. So if you look here in this animation, at the beginning, we see negative charge inside, positive charge outside. And then as the action potential begins, the charges actually flip. It becomes positively charged inside the cell during the action potential as it travels down the neuron. And that wave of reversed polarity kind of moves like the wave in a sports stadium travels through the crowd. So ion channels here, trigger ion channels here, trigger ion channels here, and it carries that complete flip of positive, negative charges all the way down the axon. And our job is to sort of understand the chemistry of why that happens. So remember, we had an imaginary voltmeter attached to the neuron right here at the axon hillock, measuring its voltage. So if we were to chart the voltage at any given point on the axon, and look at how the voltage changes as the action potential sweeps down, it would look like this. So here at resting potential, negative 70 millivolts, this is the cell hanging out, and the charge has to go up enough to hit threshold, which would be about here, negative 55 millivolts. And when it does, it triggers an enormous spike in positivity, raising the charge all the way past zero up to positive 30 millivolts or so at its peak. And then very quickly, it depolarizes again. The charge lowers back down to around that resting potential level, and it evens back out. And you see that in this animation. You see that the charges are briefly reversed, but then they return to normal. They're rebalanced as the action potential moves down the axon. So we're going to get into the details of exactly how that happens. So we've got to zoom in and take a closer look at the structure of our axon. So this is a close-up view of the axon, and the cell membrane here, just like in the rest of the neuron, is covered with ion channels that only open under certain conditions. So out in the dendrites, the ion channels opened when neurotransmitters were present. But what causes the ion channels on the axon to open? You can answer out loud or throw it up in the chat. They're not neurotransmitter sensitive. They don't open for the presence of communication chemicals. What causes these ion channels to open? Are they neurotransmitter sensitive or voltage sensitive?
They're voltage sensitive.
Yeah, so this is a structural difference in the ion channels that are embedded in the membrane of the axon versus the cell body and dendrites. These ion channels only open when they detect a charge of negative 55 millivolts, that magical number that is the threshold that causes an action potential to get started. So we're here at a close-up view of the axon. So we're going to imagine that right here, this is the very front edge of the axon hillock. So this pair of ion channels is going to be making the decision of whether or not to fire. So just as a quick review, are the two ions that really matter to an action potential traveling down the neuron are sodium and potassium. So inside the cell, which one should we expect to see highly concentrated, sodium or potassium? When the cell is at rest, when it's not firing off a message, would we see a bunch of sodium inside the cell, or would we see a bunch of potassium inside the cell?
Potassium?
Potassium.
Yeah, that's right. And we would see the sodium outside. So we've got the cell is packed with potassium inside, and there's a bunch of sodium outside. So, and then zeroing in, we see our voltage sensitive ion channels all along the axon. And in this particular graphic, the red ones are our sodium channels, and the green ones are our potassium channels. So sodium and potassium channels all over the axon are both sensitive to voltage, and they both open for the same magic number. They both open when they detect a voltage of negative 55 millivolts. But there's a really tiny difference in how they open or in their sensitivity, and that really affects how the action potential travels. So the voltage sensitive sodium channels open up at negative 55 millivolts, and so do the voltage sensitive potassium channels. They're tuned to the same voltage, but the voltage sensitive sodium channels are just a little quicker on the uptake. They detect that negative 55 millivolt magic number electrical charge a bit quicker. So they open just a little faster. So potassium channels on the axon are sort of like that friend who never quite laughs at the joke right away. They laugh like a couple minutes later after everybody's finished chuckling. They're just like a little less sensitive, a little slower on the uptake. So they open for the same electrical charge, but it just takes a millisecond longer for them to open up and let the potassium move. And that really influences how the action potential travels, which we'll see in just a second. So we're going back to our zoomed out view, and we're imagining that all of the excitatory messages coming in from the axon and from the cell body have managed to raise the charge right here at the beginning of the axon to negative 55 millivolts. And that triggers the sodium and potassium channels in the first section of the axon. Now, the sodium channels, being more sensitive, they get triggered first. And a ton of positively charged sodium floods into the cell. And that's what results in the charge inside that section of the axon becoming temporarily more positive, as we see here. So sodium is flooding in, raising the charge inside the axon in a wave that travels down the cell. So my question is, why does the action potential only travel one way? Because if sodium is flooding in at this point, what happens basically is that the positive charge, the charge shoots up in this section of the axon enough to raise the charge above threshold in the next section and trigger sodium to flood in the next section. And you can imagine that this section of the axon triggering the next one, triggering the next one. So sodium floods in here, then here, then here, and that causes the increasing positive charge. But these sodium particles can also travel this way. So we need to understand why the action potential only moves in one direction. And that depends on the action of our sort of slower, less sensitive potassium channels, because they are also going to open when the charge reaches negative 55 millivolts. And when they do, something different happens. When those potassium channels, oops, sorry, let me jump back. Okay, so here we have our sodium flooding in. The sodium's flooded in from the first section of the axon, and that triggered sodium to flood in at the next section. And it also triggered, just a millisecond later, the potassium channels to open, allowing potassium from inside the cell to flood out. Now, when the positively charged potassium ions inside the cell go shooting out of the axon, does that raise or lower the charge inside the section of the axon that they're leaving from? When potassium shoots out, the charge inside the cell, does it go up or down? So here's what it looks like. This positively charged potassium is leaving the cell. Does that lower or raise the electrical charge inside this section of the axon where the positive chemicals are leaving? Maybe I've lost you, so let me back up. So we know that the action potential is positive electrical charge moving down the cell, but we see that it quickly resets. The cell very quickly goes back to negative inside. How does it accomplish that? That is accomplished by our potassium channels. So the sodium channels raise the charge inside the cell, But then really quickly, the potassium channels are also triggered. And when the positively charged potassium floods out, it lowers the charge back down to around threshold, restoring the cell back to resting potential. So you can see the action potential would travel down the cell like this, moving down the cell. And the reason that it can't go backwards is because the potassium flooding out blocks the sodium from influencing the axon in this direction. So it can't travel backwards because of the potassium that's flooding out just after the sodium floods in. So voltage reaching threshold voltage, negative 55 millivolts, triggers sodium to come rushing in like Black Friday shoppers just after Walmart has opened on the night after Thanksgiving. And it also, a little slower, our sluggish potassium swoops back out and restores the cell to resting potential. And that wave of reverse polarity travels all the way down the axon, just like this. So if we imagine, if we look at the voltage change over time, we see that at resting potential, it's negative 70 millivolts more negative inside the cell. And then during the beginning of the action potential, when only the sodium gates have had the chance to open, the charge shoots up way up past zero, all the way to positive as all the positively charged sodium floods into the cell. But then as soon as the potassium channels catch on that threshold has been reached, the potassium starts rushing out of the cell, taking positive charges out and lowering the electrical charge inside the cell really quickly. And an important detail is that, as you can see here, our potassium channels, even though they're a little less sensitive, kind of slow on the uptake, and they don't notice that threshold has been reached as quickly as the sodium channels do, they're very overdramatic. They sort of overshoot. More potassium actually rushes out of the cell than needs to perfectly restore it to resting potential. In fact, as the action potential travels down the axon, right after the action potential has moved through the cell, it's actually a little bit more negative than usual. So the charge, as you can see at the end of the action potential, is even lower than our resting potential of negative 70 millivolts. It gets down to about negative 100. And that's because these potassium channels really overdo it. They're slow to open, but once they get open, they stay open for a little too long and they let out more potassium. And that causes what is known as the refractory period. And that's this time point right after firing an action potential when the cell is even more or less likely to fire again. So the refractory period is caused by too much potassium flooding out at once. And you can kind of compare the refractory period to flushing a toilet. So excuse the grossness of this comparison, but you know that, right after you flush a toilet, you can't flush it again as the toilet's actually flushing. You can't start a new action potential as the action potential is still traveling down the axon. It's not physically possible. That's the refractory period. And then just after, as the cell's rebalancing, it takes a little bit more positive input to bring the charge up to threshold because it's temporarily a bit more negative. And this creates a natural limit on how often any given neuron can fire an action potential. It turns out that the cutoff is around 200 action potentials per second. The cell simply cannot fire faster than that. It can fire a lot slower,